The name was already there when Myrtle Vaughn found it. She had ridden out to the ridge post at the edge of her father's property because the fence line needed checking, because 3 of their cattle had gone missing, because she could not spend another suffocating afternoon inside that farmhouse watching her father drink himself into a stupor and call it grief. She had her reasons. Good, practical, sensible reasons. She was not expecting to find anything unusual about a weathered cedar post at the northeastern corner of the Vaughn land. But there it was. Cut deep into the grain with what must have been a sharp blade, deliberate and unhurried, the letters carved with a care that suggested the person who made them had taken their time. Myrtle Vaughn. Not just her first name. Both names. Full and complete and impossibly present, as though whoever had done this had known exactly who she was before she knew they existed. Her blood went cold. She looked around the open land, the flat scrub stretching out toward the distant mesa in every direction, the afternoon sky blazing copper and rust. Nothing moved. No horse. No rider. No shadow breaking the monotony of the desert brush. Just her and the wind, and her name cut into wood like a claim. Like a warning, like something she could not yet name but felt in the deepest, most frightened corridor of her chest. Her hand found the handle of the small pistol at her hip. Her father had insisted she carry it back when he still insisted on things. It was a Smith & Wesson Model 3 and she knew how to use it. She had learned young. You had to out here. You had to learn everything young. She did not pull the weapon. But she kept her hand there as she turned Biscuit, her roan mare, in a slow circle, scanning the ridgeline, the dry creek bed to the south, the cluster of mesquite bushes that could hide a man if a man were small enough and determined enough. Nothing. She looked back at the post. The carving was not new, she realized. The wood inside the cuts had dried and darkened. This had been done days ago, maybe longer. Someone had been here before her. Someone had known her name. Someone had carved that name into the fence post at the edge of her family's land and then vanished. And she had been living her ordinary, grinding, sorrowful life not 3 miles away, entirely unaware that somewhere in the world a stranger was thinking about her with enough focused intention to press a knife into cedar and leave proof of it. She was 24 years old, and she had never been so frightened or so strangely, inexplicably moved in her entire life. That was the moment everything changed. But to understand how a thing like that could both terrify and ignite a woman, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to go back to the August of 1882 in the territory of New Mexico, when the summer heat lay over the land like a punishment from heaven, and a man named Seth Barnett rode into the town of Caldera Wells with nothing but a horse, a bedroll, a few dollars in his coat pocket, and a secret so heavy it had been bending him toward the earth for 3 years running. Caldera Wells was not a town that welcomed strangers warmly. It was too small for that, too tired, too weathered by seasons of drought and the particular human violence that had plagued the region since the Lincoln County War had spilled its chaos in every direction. The town had a general store, a livery, a saloon called the Copper Bell, a post office that doubled as a barber shop, and a church that the pastor had abandoned in 1880 and no one had yet replaced. There was a sheriff, a man named Dale Purvis, who wore his badge like a permanent grievance and trusted no one, least of all outsiders. Seth Barnett arrived on a Tuesday. He was 28 years old, broad through the shoulders, dark-haired with pale gray eyes that caught the light in a way that made people uneasy, as though whatever he was looking at he was also looking through. He wore a long coat despite the heat, and he did not look like a man who was passing through casually. He looked like a man who had decided to stop running, at least for a while, though the decision was evidently costing him something. He went to the livery first. That was always how you read a man in the West. Did he water and stable his horse before he did anything for himself? Seth Barnett did. He handed 2 bits to the stable boy, a 12-year-old named Clarence who eyed the newcomer with open curiosity, and he made sure the animal had water and fresh hay before he walked across the main street to the Copper Bell. He ordered a whiskey. He did not drink it immediately. He set it on the bar in front of him and looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at the mirror behind the bar and at the reflection of the room behind him, cataloging everything with those unsettling gray eyes. A habit. The habit of a man who had learned the hard way that the most dangerous thing in any room was whatever was at his back. The bartender, a heavy-set man named Gus with a scar running from his left ear to his jaw, studied the stranger the way bartenders did, professionally and without obvious judgment. Passing through, Gus asked. "Looking for work," Seth said. His voice was low and even. It was the voice of a man who did not waste words. Gus tilted his head. "What kind of work?" "Ranch work. Fencing, cattle, whatever needs doing. I'm good with horses." "You might try the Vaughn place," Gus said, after a pause that suggested he was deciding whether the information was worth giving. "Old Elias Vaughn's been running that spread with half the crew he needs since the drought 2 summers back. Lost most of his hands. His daughter's been doing the work of 3 men from what I hear." Seth absorbed this information. "Where's the property?" "East of town, about 3 miles. Follow the road past the old Hector mill, take the fork south, follow the ridge line, you can't miss it. Big cedar fence posts at the corners, painted white." Gus paused again. "Fair warning, old Elias drinks. His daughter, she's the one who actually runs things. Myrtle's her name, she's—" He searched for the right word. "She doesn't suffer fools." "Good," Seth said, and he drank his whiskey. He did not ride out to the Vaughn property that evening. He took a room at the boarding house, a spare and dusty room with a single window that looked out over the main street, and he sat on the edge of the narrow bed with his coat still on and his hands on his knees, and he stared at the floor. He had a habit of doing this. In the quietest moments, when there was nothing immediate requiring his attention, the past had a way of filling the available space, and he let it, because fighting it had only ever made it worse. 3 years ago, Seth Barnett had been a deputy marshal in the territory of Texas, under a man named Harlan Cross, who turned out to be the most corrupt lawman Seth had ever encountered. Cross had been running a protection scheme with a gang of cattle thieves, taking a cut of stolen herds and looking the other way when it suited him, occasionally framing innocent men when someone needed to take the blame. Seth had discovered this slowly, piece by piece, the way you uncover a betrayal, not in a single devastating moment, but in an accumulating series of small wrongnesses that eventually add up to something undeniable. He had made the mistake of confronting Cross directly. Cross had his own dark past and his own hidden motives, and he was not a man who responded well to being cornered. Seth had barely escaped with his life. He had certainly not escaped with his reputation or his badge. Cross had turned the story around with the efficiency of a man who had been preparing for exactly this kind of threat, and suddenly Seth was the one with warrants out in 3 counties, and Cross was the respected lawman writing official reports about a deputy gone bad. 3 years of drifting. 3 years of staying 1 county ahead of the warrants, which had mostly gone cold now, which was why Seth had risked stopping. Caldera Wells was remote enough to be safe, small enough that news traveled slowly. He needed time to figure out what came next. He needed steady work and a quiet place to gather himself, and perhaps, he thought, in the way men sometimes think things quietly without acknowledging them clearly, he needed a reason to stay somewhere. Any somewhere. Before the wandering ate him alive from the inside. He lay back on the bed fully dressed and stared at the ceiling and waited for morning. He rode out to the Vaughn property the next day just after sunrise, when the light was still gentle and the desert smelled of sage and the previous night's brief coolness. He found the property without difficulty. The cedar fence posts, the ones Gus had mentioned, white painted, stood at the corners of the land like sentinels. Seth pulled his horse to a stop at the northeastern post, the first one he reached from the road, and he looked at it for a long moment. Later, he would not be able to fully explain what came over him. He was not a fanciful man. He was not given to impulsive acts, particularly ones without clear practical purpose. But something about the post, about the quality of the morning light, about the sensation of having arrived somewhere after so long of arriving nowhere, made him reach into his coat pocket for the small jackknife he always carried. He pressed the blade to the wood. He carved 2 words slowly and then 2 more, cutting each letter with care, pressing deep enough to last. Myrtle Vaughn. He did not know her. He had only heard her name once from a bartender who had described her as someone who did not suffer fools. He did not understand the impulse then and could not articulate it afterward. He only knew that it felt like marking the beginning of something, and that he had been moving through the world for 3 years without any beginnings whatsoever, only the endless middle of a man running from his own dark past, and something about this particular post on this particular morning in this particular territory made him need to mark the moment he stopped. He folded the knife. He walked his horse to the farmhouse and knocked on the door. He did not know then that days would pass before Myrtle Vaughn rode out to check that corner of the fence line. He did not know that she would find her name carved into the wood and feel the world lurch beneath her feet. He only knew when the door opened and a girl of about 14 looked up at him with Elias Vaughn's dark eyes and her own sharp jaw that he had arrived at the right place. "I'm looking for work," he told the girl. "My name's Seth Barnett. I heard your family might need hands." The girl studied him. "That's for my sister to decide," she said. "You'll have to wait." Her name was Clara Vaughn, and she was Myrtle's younger sister, and she turned out to be one of the most astute judges of character Seth had ever met, which he would not discover until later. She made him wait on the porch, which he did without complaint, sitting on the top step with his hat in his hands, watching a pair of hawks circle over the western mesa, thinking about nothing in particular and everything at once. Myrtle came around from the back of the property 20 minutes later, leading a dun-colored horse by the bridle, her boots dusty to the knee, her dark hair tied back under a worn hat. She was tall for a woman of her era, nearly 5'8", lean and strong in the way of people who do physical labor every day, and she had the kind of face that was not conventionally pretty but was so thoroughly itself, so direct and alive and sharply present, that prettiness seemed like a lesser category entirely. She stopped when she saw him. There was a brief assessment in her eyes, quick and thorough, the kind of look that had probably helped her survive being a woman running a cattle operation in 1882 New Mexico territory. "Clara says you're looking for work," she said. She did not say hello, and neither did he, and somehow that suited them both. "That's right," Seth said. He had stood when she appeared. He held his hat and kept his eyes on her face and let her look at him as long as she needed to. "What's your experience?" "Ranch work mostly. Fencing, cattle drives, horse breaking. I spent 2 years on the good night-loving trail before it was mostly shut down. I know cattle country." "Where are you from originally?" "Texas, east of Amarillo." Her eyes narrowed slightly, and he had the uncomfortable feeling she was looking for something specific. "What brings you to Caldera Wells?" "Looking for somewhere to land for a while," he said. It was the most honest thing he could say without being specific enough to be dangerous. She was quiet for a moment. "I'll give you a trial," she said finally. 3 weeks. You work well, we'll talk about a proper arrangement. I can't pay much, but there's a bunk in the hands, quarters and meals included. I need someone who can ride, fix fence and manage the cattle without supervision. I don't have time to supervise." "Understood," he said. "I don't tolerate drinking on the job," she added, and there was something in her voice when she said it that went beyond a standard employer's rule. Something personal. Something pained. "I don't drink on the job," he said. She held his eyes for another moment, decided something, and then said, "Come around back and I'll show you the bunkhouse." She paused, then added something that felt less like a formality and more like a genuine cost to her. "I'm Myrtle Vaughn." "Seth Barnett," he said. "Thank you for the chance." She turned and led her horse around the side of the house, and he fell in behind her and the story began. The first week was work and nothing else. Seth rose before dawn, worked through the heat of the day without complaint, and proved immediately that he had not lied about his skills. He could read cattle with a practiced eye, mend a broken wire fence line faster than most men twice his age, and he had a gift with horses that was not teachable, the kind that came from something instinctive and deep. Myrtle's battered herd, 140 longhorns spread across 300 acres of difficult terrain, had been inadequately managed for months. Seth moved through the work like a man making up for lost time, which in a sense he was. He and Myrtle spoke little at first, but what they said was direct and purposeful, the way people speak when they are both used to handling hard things alone. She would tell him what needed doing, he would do it, and in the evenings they would sometimes cross paths on the porch or near the water trough and exchange brief assessments of the day's work. It was professional. It was practical. It was also quietly electric, in the way of two people who are almost painfully aware of each other without having decided yet to do anything about it. Clara watched them both with undisguised interest. She was 14 and sharp as a tack, and she had none of her sister's guardedness. "I like him," she told Myrtle on the third evening, with the directness of someone who saw no reason not to say what she thought. "He's an employee," Myrtle said, without looking up from the account she was trying to reconcile at the kitchen table. So that means I'm not supposed to like him in the way you mean. Who said anything about a way?" Clara asked, all innocence, and Myrtle threw a dishcloth at her. On the fifth day, Seth found the missing cattle, all three of them, penned in a dry wash 2 miles east of the property boundary, with the marks of a recently extinguished fire nearby and tracks suggesting at least 2 riders had been there not long before. He rode back to the property and told Myrtle what he had found. She went very still. "You said tracks of 2 men," she said. "At least 2, could be 3. Hard to tell with the ground that dry. Did you recognize anything?" she asked, and her voice had a specific tautness to it that told him she already suspected something. "I'm new here," he said carefully. "I wouldn't recognize anyone's tracks." She took her hat off and turned it in her hands. "There's a man named Cord DeLacy," she said slowly, as though the name cost something to say. "He's been making claims that some of this land rightfully belongs to him, an old boundary dispute he's been escalating. The missing cattle, the cut fence line on the south edge last month, a fire in one of the outbuildings a few weeks before you arrived." She put her hat back on. "Nothing I can prove. Nothing Sheriff Purvis is particularly interested in investigating." Seth absorbed this. "Why isn't Purvis interested?" Myrtle smiled, but it was not a warm smile. "Because Cord DeLacy drinks at the Copper Bell every Friday night and Dale Purvis drinks alongside him, and men who drink together have a way of developing aligned interests." There it was, the hidden motive, the trap being slowly constructed around a woman who was doing everything right and being punished for it anyway. Seth felt something cold and familiar settle in his chest. He knew this shape of injustice. He had seen it before. "I'll keep an eye on the east boundary," he said. She looked at him for a long moment. "I don't want you doing anything that puts you at risk," she said, and the sentence surprised them both with its warmth. She recovered quickly. "I mean I can't afford to lose a ranch hand right now." "Of course," he said. Neither of them acknowledged the other meaning. On the 9th day, Seth was repairing the fence line near the northeastern corner post when he stopped and looked at the carving he had made. The letters of her name, deep and deliberate in the cedar wood. He had almost forgotten he had done it, or rather he had been actively not thinking about it in the way you sometimes avoid thinking about things that reveal too much about you. He was still standing there, staring at it, when he heard hooves and turned to see Myrtle approaching on Biscuit. She had not been expecting him to be at this corner today. He could see from her expression as she drew closer that she had already seen the carving. Her eyes went from the post to his face, and he could read the cascade of realizations moving across her features, the shock, the confusion, the dawning understanding, and something else beneath all of it, something that she was working very hard to keep contained. She pulled Biscuit to a stop a few feet away and looked at him steadily. "That was you," she said. It was not a question. "Yes," he said. Before you ever introduced yourself, she said. The tautness in her voice was different from the Cord de Lacy tautness. This was more fragile. Yes. Why? She asked, and the word was very quiet, but it held about 17 different questions inside it. He thought about lying. He could see the path of it, could construct something plausible about marking the property boundary, about the carving being accidental or professional. He discarded all of it. He was tired of lying. He had been lying for 3 years about everything that mattered, and he was profoundly, bone-deep exhausted by it. I don't know exactly, he said. I rode up to that post on a Tuesday morning knowing nothing about you except your name, and something made me stop. I was using a knife to test the wood, to see if the posts needed replacing. He paused, knowing that was still a partial lie. And then I just started carving. I told myself it was because the name sounded like it belonged to someone real, someone who actually lived on this land and cared about it, which turned out to be true. Myrtle looked at him for a long time. A hawk called somewhere high above them. The wind moved through the dry grass along the fence line. That is one of the strangest things anyone has ever done in regard to me, she said finally. I know. It's also a little frightening, she said, to find your name somewhere you didn't put it. I know that too, he said. I'm sorry for the fright. Another long pause. Then something shifted in her expression, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. The carving is very neat, she said. He blinked. I beg your pardon. The letters, they're very even. You have a careful hand. He stared at her. She held his gaze with that direct, alive quality of hers that seemed to see everything and process it faster than he could track. Thank you, he said carefully. She clicked her tongue and turned Biscuit back toward the house. Halfway there, she looked back over her shoulder. The south fence line needs work near the dry wash, she said. If you've finished here. Yes, ma'am, he said, and meant it completely differently than an employee means it. He spent the next 2 hours mending the south fence and thinking about a woman who had found her own name carved into a post by a man she had met 3 days ago, and responded to it by complimenting his penmanship. He thought this might be the most interesting person he had encountered in his 28 years on the earth. The weeks became a rhythm. Early mornings with strong coffee that Clara made better than anyone. Long days of labor under the relentless New Mexico sun. Evenings that gradually grew longer and more talked out as September began to soften the heat at the edges. Elias Vaughn emerged from the farmhouse occasionally, a gaunt man with Myrtle's dark eyes and none of her steadiness, looking at Seth with the suspicious wariness of a man who has had reasons to be suspicious. Seth was respectful without being obsequious. He understood grieving men. He understood the way grief could hollow a man out and fill the hollow with something destructive. Elias had lost his wife, Myrtle and Clara's mother, Eleanor, to a fever 3 years ago. The same year Seth had lost his career and his name. There were a lot of 3 years ago wounds walking around in the world, Seth had found. He also discovered, gradually, that Myrtle's situation was more precarious than he had initially understood. The drought of 1880 had damaged the land badly. She had rebuilt methodically, carefully, taking out a small loan from the bank in Santa Fe and working herself and the land with ferocious discipline. But the loan had terms that required significant cattle sales by the end of the year, and Cord de Lacy's harassment was specifically designed to interfere with that. Missing cattle, damaged fencing, an outbuilding burned, an implied threat in every incident that said, "This land can be made to fail." He told all of this to Seth one evening in the second week of September, sitting on the porch after Clara had gone inside and Elias had retreated to his room. She told it the way she told most hard things, directly and without self-pity, but he could hear what it cost her. "The worst part," she said, her eyes on the darkening horizon, "is that I know what he's doing and I can't stop it. Every incident is something I can't prove. Every complaint to Purvis is something Purvis can dismiss. I'm fighting something I can't fully see and I'm losing ground." "You're not losing yet," Seth said. She looked at him. "Not yet," she agreed, and there was something in the exchange that felt like a quiet declaration of alliance. "Tell me about de Lacy," Seth said. "Everything you know," she told him. Cord DeLacy was 40 years old, born in the territory, the second son of a ranching family that had been neighbors to the Vaughns for 20 years. He had always resented the Vaughn land, claiming that an old survey error had placed part of the boundary incorrectly in the Vaughns' favor. His father had accepted the legal outcome when the matter had gone before a land court in 1873. Cord had never accepted it. After his father died in 1879 and the elder brother, who had been reasonable, moved to California, Cord had escalated the campaign against the Vaughn property steadily and methodically. "He wants to break you financially," Seth said. "Force a sale at a low price, then acquire the land." "That's what I believe," Myrtle said. "But belief and proof are different things." "They are," Seth said. "But proof has a way of appearing if you know what to look for." She looked at him with a particular expression, one that combined uncertainty with something like desperate hope. "You sound like you have experience with this kind of situation." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have some experience with corruption operating through legitimate structures. I know how it tends to work." He kept it general. He was not ready to tell her the rest. The rest was dangerous and complicated, and he was still not sure how much of it was safe to share. "Experience from where?" she asked, and her voice was careful and curious. "Later," he said, and immediately worried it sounded like a brush-off. "I mean, I'll tell you the whole thing, just not tonight." He looked at her. "I owe you an honest account of who I am. You've trusted me with your livelihood. You deserve to know what you're trusting." She held his gaze. "All right," she said. "Later, then." They sat in silence for a while, the good kind of silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled, that comes from two people who are comfortable in the same space. The stars came out over the mesa one by one, and the coyotes began their distant conversation to the west, and Myrtle Vaughn and Seth Barnett sat on her porch in the cooling night air, and for a little while neither of them was carrying anything too heavy to bear. 2 days later, the situation with Cord DeLacy sharpened into something unavoidable. Seth was repairing the roof of the main barn, 3 weeks into his employment and officially past the trial period, when he heard horses coming fast up the road. He straightened on the roof and shaded his eyes. 4 riders coming from the east. He recognized the lead horse before he recognized the man. Cord DeLacy was built wide and heavy, with a drooping mustache and the kind of face that had once been handsome and then curdled. He rode like a man accustomed to having his arrival matter, and the 3 riders behind him had the look of hired muscle, men who were paid for their physical presence more than their moral reasoning. Seth was off the roof and on the ground before they reached the gate. He did not make a production of it, but he was standing squarely in the yard when DeLacy pulled up, and there was nothing ambiguous about his posture. Myrtle had come out of the house already. She must have heard the horses. She stood on the porch steps with her hands loose at her sides and her chin up, and Seth thought she looked more formidable than most armed men he had known. "Myrtle," DeLacy said by way of greeting, not Miss Vaughn. The deliberate familiarity was a small, calculated insult. "Cord," she said, matching his register. 2 could play at that game. His eyes slid to Seth. "New hand." "That's right," she said. DeLacy's eyes moved over Seth with the slow, dismissive assessment of a man who did not feel the need to take anyone else's measure seriously. Seth returned the look with absolute stillness, the way he had learned to look at Harlan Cross, and DeLacy's assessment stalled slightly. "I came to talk about the south boundary," DeLacy said, looking back at Myrtle. 2 of my steers got mixed into your herd. I want them back." "Bring me the brand descriptions and I'll sort through the cattle," Myrtle said. Her voice was even and professional, but Seth could see the slight tightening around her eyes. "I'd rather come look myself," DeLacy said. "You're welcome to come back with the brand descriptions and a sheriff's witness, and I'll be happy to accommodate that," Myrtle said. DeLacy smiled, and it was not a pleasant thing. "Had a lot of formality for neighbors, Myrtle." "We're not neighbors the way that word usually means," she said. "We're adjacent landowners with a disputed history. Formality protects both of us." DeLacy looked at Seth again. "Your new hand teaching you lawyerly language." "I taught myself," Myrtle said, and the finality of it was impressive. DeLacy sat on his horse for another beat, the quiet kind of threat that required nothing overt to be felt fully by everyone present. Then he turned his horse. "I'll be back," he said, to no one in particular, and rode away with his 3 hired men behind him. Seth watched them until they were off the property. Then he turned to look at Myrtle, who let out a very controlled exhale. "He doesn't have 2 stray steers," she said quietly. "No," Seth agreed. "He doesn't. That was a reconnaissance visit," she said. "Yes," he said. "He wanted to see who you had working for you." She looked at him steadily. "And what did he see?" Seth held her gaze. "Someone who's not going anywhere." Something moved in her expression. Something that was not professional or guarded but very much personal and immediate. She held it there for only a moment before she recovered herself, but it was long enough. "Good," she said. "Then I need to show you the rest of the property, because if he's going to make a move, it'll be from somewhere you haven't seen yet." They spent the afternoon riding the full perimeter of the Vaughn land, 300 acres of it, and Seth paid close attention to every approach and natural hiding place, every dry creek and shadow-heavy rock formation. He was doing what he had been trained to do once, the systematic cataloging of vulnerabilities. The habits of a former lawman did not leave you, even when the badge did. By the time they reached the northeastern corner post again, the evening light was coming in gold and sideways, and it hit the cedar post in a way that made the carved letters stand out clearly. Myrtle's name in the wood, Seth's handwriting. Myrtle looked at it for a moment without speaking. "I keep thinking about why you did that," she said. "I've been thinking about it too," he admitted. "Have you reached a conclusion?" He was quiet for a moment. The gold light moved. Biscuit twitched at a fly. His own horse, a bay named Mercury, shifted his weight patiently. "I think," Seth said slowly, "that I had been moving for a long time without direction. And then I heard someone describe you, a woman who does not suffer fools, who is carrying more than one person should carry alone, who has built something real in difficult country." He stopped, reconsidered, continued. "And I think I needed to mark the moment I arrived at somewhere that mattered, even before I knew it mattered. Something in the description made it matter." Myrtle was very quiet. A bird called in the distance. "That is either the most thoughtful thing anyone has ever said to me," she said at last, "or you are a very unusual kind of danger." "Both, maybe," he said honestly. She looked at him with those direct, seeing eyes, and then she said, "Tell me now." "What you said you'd tell me later, about yourself." He did. He told her everything, right there by the fence post with the evening coming on, the full story of Harlan Cross and the corruption and the warrants that had since gone mostly cold, the 3 years of drifting, the things he had seen and done and run from. He told it plainly, without excuses, letting her draw her own conclusions. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time. He waited because he had learned to let silences be. "The warrants," she said finally, "you said mostly cold. There's one county in Texas where the paperwork was filed by a deputy who actually cared about accuracy," he said. "It might still be active." "I don't know." And Cross himself, still operating last I heard, still wearing his badge. She absorbed this. "So you're carrying a dark past that isn't even your fault," she said. "That's a particular kind of weight." "Yes," he said. "And if someone were to investigate Cross properly, if someone were to gather the evidence of what he actually did, the warrants against you would likely be dismissed." He looked at her. "In theory. Nothing like that needs to happen immediately," she said. "We have enough to deal with." She looked at the fence post again. "But I want you to understand something. What you just told me, the honest account of who you are, that matters more to me than clean paperwork. I've known men with clean paperwork who were rotten straight through." She did not name her father, but Seth understood she meant him, at least in part. He felt something loosen in his chest that had been tight for 3 years. "Thank you," he said, and meant it with his entire body. She looked at him then with something unguarded in her face, something that made her look younger and less armored, and he was aware of how close they were in the failing light, both of them on horseback, their knees nearly parallel, the carved post just behind her. "I should get back," she said, her voice slightly different from its usual register. "Yes," he said, not moving. She smiled. It was the first full smile he had seen from her, not the wry half-smile of a woman managing difficult circumstances, but something real and warm. It was brief, but it was complete. "Thank you for telling me," she said. "Thank you for listening," he said. They rode back in the gathering dusk, not quite side by side, and the tension between them was no longer entirely about survival or employment. It was alive and specific and belonged only to them. The following weeks brought the autumn shift to the land, the heat easing by degrees, the nights turning cool enough for a fire in the evenings. Clara noticed everything, because Clara always noticed everything, and she began strategically occupying herself in other rooms when Seth was around, or inventing reasons to be elsewhere during evening hours, with the delicacy of a 14-year-old who is convinced she is being extremely subtle. Elias Vaughn had one of his better spells in late September. He emerged from his room for several consecutive days, clear-eyed and steady, and he sat with Seth on the porch one evening, while Myrtle was inside working on the accounts and Clara was in bed. He was quiet at first, looking out at the dark land. "You're good for this place," Elias said finally. It came out stiffly, like a man saying something he has been building toward for a while. "I'm trying to be useful," Seth said carefully. "More than useful," Elias said. He looked at Seth with eyes that were temporarily clear and very aware. "She hasn't asked anyone for help since Alina died. Not once. Takes it as a personal failing to need anything from anyone." He paused. "She's asking you." "I don't think she'd describe it as asking," Seth said. The old man made a sound that might have been a laugh. "She wouldn't. She'd describe it as a practical arrangement with a paid employee." He looked at Seth steadily. "Is that all you are?" Seth held the old man's gaze. "No," he said, "but it's her decision, whatever it is, not mine." Elias nodded slowly. "Good answer," he said. He went inside shortly after. Seth sat alone in the dark and let himself feel, for the first time in 3 years, something that was not the dull weight of hiding or the sharp edge of fear, something warmer and more frightening in its own way. He was falling in love with Myrtle Vaughn, and he had been for some time, possibly since the moment she walked around the corner of her house leading a horse and said, "Clara says you're looking for work," with all the warmth of a land survey. And that was terrifying, not because he didn't want it, but because he was a man with a compromised past, and she was a woman with everything at stake, and those two things, held up together in the dark, were an enormous amount to carry. He went to bed and did not sleep well, which was entirely appropriate. October arrived, and with it the first genuine threat. Seth came in from the north pasture one morning to find Myrtle white-faced at the kitchen table with a letter in her hand. She handed it to him without preamble. It was from the bank in Santa Fe. The loan terms had been adjusted, citing concerns about the property's productivity. The payment deadline had been moved forward by 6 weeks. "DeLacy," Seth said. "The bank manager is a man named Porter Sims," Myrtle said, her voice controlled. "Porter Sims has a brother-in-law who does business with Cord DeLacy." She paused. "I've done my research." "You knew this was a possibility," Seth said. "I suspected it. I didn't know they would move this fast." She looked at the letter again. "I need to sell 40 cattle by the 1st of November. Full price, no discounts. I need a buyer I can trust in a timeline that isn't possible through normal channels." Seth's mind was already moving. "There's a ranching operation out of Las Cruces," he said. "Bowman and Sons. I worked a drive for them 2 years ago. They buy large lots on short notice when the price is right." She looked at him sharply. "You know them personally?" "I know Abel Bowman personally. He's straight." He paused. "If I write to him today, we might have a response in 10 days. If the price is fair, he'll buy." Myrtle looked at him for a long moment. "Write the letter," she said. He wrote it that afternoon at the kitchen table, and she read it over his shoulder. And it was the first time she was that close to him in a purely practical context, and the proximity was remarkable, and neither of them commented on it. But both of them were aware of it in every nerve. The letter went out with the stage that evening. While they waited for the response, the pressure from DeLacy continued. 3 fence posts on the south boundary were cut in a single night. 2 of the Vaughn's dogs were found drugged with something, not dead but deeply unconscious and useless as watchdogs for 12 hours. Seth began sleeping with his rifle at his side in the bunkhouse and checking the property twice each night. Quiet patrols he did not mention to Myrtle because he did not want to add to her burdens, though she eventually found out because Myrtle found out most things. "You've been patrolling at night," she said one evening, not accusingly but with that particular directness of hers that made evasion feel more work than it was worth. "Yes," he said. "How long?" "Since the fence posts." She was quiet. "You should have told me." "You already have too much to carry," he said. She turned to look at him fully, and there was something in her expression that was not quite anger but was related to it. "Don't decide what I should know based on what you think I can handle," she said quietly. "I have been handling things alone for 3 years. I don't need to be managed." He took that the way it was meant. "You're right," he said. "I apologize." She held his gaze for another moment, and then something in her expression softened. "I do appreciate it," she said. "The patrolling. I just want to know about it." "From now on," he said. "From now on," she agreed. They looked at each other in the way they had been looking at each other more and more frequently, with too much and too complicated to say simply and too little space between them to say nothing at all. It was Clara who finally, in her characteristic lack of patience with other people's circuitousness, did something about it. On a Wednesday evening in mid-October, Clara announced at dinner that she had a severe headache and was going to bed immediately, and fixed Seth and Myrtle both with a look of absolutely transparent innocence that fooled no one and was probably not intended to. She went to bed. Elias had already retreated to his room. Seth and Myrtle were left at the kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee and the remains of supper, and no practical excuse to immediately part ways. After a moment of silence, Myrtle laughed. It was a real laugh, startled and warm, entirely unguarded, and it changed her face in a way Seth was not prepared for. "She has no headache," Myrtle said. "Not even a small one," Seth agreed. "She's been doing this for 2 weeks," Myrtle said. "I know," Seth said. "She's very committed." Myrtle shook her head, still with something of the laugh still in her expression, and then looked at her coffee cup and then looked at him. "Seth," she said. "Yes," he said. "I need to ask you something directly." "Please do," he said. She took a breath. "What is this between us? What are you? What do you want it to be?" He felt the question land in his chest like a clean, clear note. He set his coffee down. "I think you already know what I want it to be," he said quietly. "The question is what you want." She looked at him steadily. "I am a woman with a compromised property, a loan due in November, a father who is not well, a sister to raise, and a neighbor who is trying to ruin me," she said. "I am also a woman who has not had anyone to simply be with for a very long time. Simply being with someone is more valuable than people give it credit for," Seth said. "I also," she continued, as though building courage by continuing, "found my name carved into a fence post by a stranger, which remains one of the most unsettling and strangely flattering things that has ever happened to me, and I have been thinking about it every single day since." He said nothing. He let her get to wherever she was going. "I am not a simple woman," she said. "I'm not easy or uncomplicated or especially soft. I've been told that." "By whom?" he asked, and the edge in his voice surprised them both. "By various people over the years," she said with a small twist at the corner of her mouth. "They were wrong," he said. "You're not soft in the way people use that as a compliment when they mean compliant, but you are genuinely, specifically kind. The way you treat Clara. The way you managed my fumbling explanation by that fence post. The way you run this land, not hard-heartedly but with enormous care." He paused. "The people who said you weren't those things were people who wanted you easier to manage." She was very still. "I would never want you easier to manage," he said. "I would want you exactly as you are." The kitchen was quiet, just the distant sound of the night wind and a horse shifting in the stable. "That carving," she said at last, and her voice was very soft. I think I understand it now. You were marking the beginning, you said that. Yes. The beginning of something you didn't know yet what it was. Yes. And now, he looked at her. Now I know exactly what it is, he said. And I know it matters more than anything I've stumbled across in a long time. He paused. But I also know I'm a man with a complicated situation, and I won't ask you to take that on without knowing fully what it means. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. It was deliberate and quiet and entirely like her. No drama, no preamble, just the direct expression of what she had decided. I've already taken it on, she said. The moment you told me the truth by that fence post and I didn't send you away, I took it on. He turned his hand over and held hers. And that was how it began, in the unromantic, honest, thoroughly practical way of two people who had each been through enough to know what was real. He kissed her that evening, standing on the porch after she had walked him out in the cool October air. A gentle and unhurried kiss that was every bit as deliberate as the carving had been and considerably more self-aware. She kissed him back and then rested her forehead against his for a moment with her eyes closed, and he thought that was the best thing he had ever experienced in his life. Clara came out the next morning wearing the expression of someone who had won an argument that had not officially been held. Neither Seth nor Myrtle confirmed anything to her. They didn't need to. Abel Bowman's response to Seth's letter came on the 14th day, brought by a rider from Las Cruces who clearly had no idea what he was carrying. Bowman agreed to buy 45 head at full market price, to be delivered to Las Cruces by the 28th of October. It was tight, but it was possible. The money would more than cover the accelerated loan payment, with enough left over to give Myrtle room to breathe. She read the letter 3 times, and then she looked at Seth with something new in her expression, something that included gratitude but was deeper than gratitude, the look of someone who has been fighting alone and has suddenly, genuinely, not for the first time in recent weeks, felt the weight lift slightly. We need to get the cattle to Las Cruces, she said. I'll lead the drive, Seth said. If you can hire one more hand for a week and if you come to manage the sale. She looked at him. You want me to come? You need to be there for the paperwork and the money exchange, he said practically. And, he added, I'd like you there, she smiled. That's the first time you've said I'd like directly, she observed. I'm practicing, he said. He hired a young man named Tom Ferris from town, 17 years old and dependable, and the three of them, Seth, Myrtle, and Tom, drove 45 Vaughn Longhorns south across the desert toward Las Cruces over 3 days in the cooling autumn. Clara stayed with a neighbor family in town. Elias was in one of his difficult spells, and Clara managed him with a competence that was heartbreaking and impressive in equal measure. The drive itself was something Seth would remember for the rest of his life. The land in that season, the desert coming off the hammering summer, the Ocotillo going brown at the edges, the mountains cutting blue and sharp against the sky, the cattle moving in their particular churning way, Myrtle on biscuit at the flank, tireless and utterly at home. 3 evenings of campfires and coffee and conversation that went longer than it needed to, past the point of practicality and into the territory of two people who were discovering each other with increasing delight. He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher when she was young, before the farm and the losses had defined the trajectory of her life. He told her there was nothing that said she couldn't be both. She said she might hold him to that one day, and the future tense of the sentence landed between them warmly. She learned that he played the harmonica badly, which she found disproportionately charming. He played it by the fire the second night, and she listened with her chin on her knees and her eyes reflecting the light. And Tom Ferris, 17 and oblivious to atmosphere, fell asleep sitting upright before the 3rd song was done. You really are quite bad at that, she said. I know, he said. Play another one, she said. The sale in Las Cruces went clean and straightforward. Abel Bowman was a large, calm man in his 50s who shook hands like he meant it and paid in full, and he looked at Seth and then at Myrtle, and then back at Seth with the expression of a man comprehending a situation and approving of it. And he said, Good cattle, solid breeding, which was technically about the Longhorns but felt like it covered more ground. They rode back with the money and the feeling of something achieved, and Myrtle made the loan payment to the bank in Santa Fe via telegraph upon their return, 2 days before the moved-up deadline, and the defeat on Porter Sims's face when he confirmed receipt of the funds was something Myrtle did not mention but Seth saw in her eyes when she described the interaction. Cord DeLacy was not finished, however. Men like Cord DeLacy were never simply finished. On the 3rd of November, a man came to Caldera Wells who Seth recognized, though not from anything local. He was a slender man in a gray coat who arrived on the afternoon stage and took a room at the boarding house, and Seth saw him from the window of the general store where he had gone to pick up supplies, and something went cold in his stomach. His name was Roy Jeffers. He was a private investigator from Texas, occasionally contracted by county sheriffs to locate wanted men. He had been part of Harlan Cross's extended network, not a corrupt man exactly, but a for-hire man, and those were sometimes worse because they had no loyalty to anyone or anything. Seth did not panic. He had trained himself out of panic. He went back to the Vaughn property, found Myrtle at the water trough working with 2 new calves, and told her directly. "There's a man in town who might be looking for me," he said. "Roy Jeffers. He's a private investigator who works with Texas law enforcement." She straightened up, wiping her hands on her work apron. "For the warrants." "Possibly. I don't know for certain that he's here for me, but the coincidence of his arrival is too pointed to ignore." She looked at him steadily. "What do you want to do?" He noticed she said, "What do you want to do?" not "What are you going to do?" The distinction mattered. "I don't want to run," he said. "I'm done running." "Then we deal with it," she said, with a matter-of-factness that he found extraordinary. "Myrtle," he said, "if he has active paperwork, this could be serious." "I know what serious looks like," she said. "I've been managing Sirius for 3 years." She held his gaze. "You told me the truth about who you are and what you did. That matters. We're not going to run from a situation where the truth is on your side." He felt something vast and warm move through his chest. "I need to write to someone," he said. "There's a federal marshal in Albuquerque named Daniel Cray. He's honest. I know his reputation, and he has jurisdiction over territory lawmen. If I can get Cray interested in Cross's operation, it changes everything." "Write the letter," she said, exactly as she had said it about Abel Bowman. Her faith in the letters he wrote was itself a kind of love, he thought. He wrote 2 letters that night, one to Marshal Cray and one to a man he knew in Texas who had worked alongside Cross and had always been quietly uncomfortable with what he witnessed. Between the 2 of them, if they responded, Seth might be able to build the kind of documented account that would give Cray reason to act. Roy Jeffers spent 3 days in Caldera Wells asking quiet questions, and Seth went about his work on the Vaughn property with a steady hand and a controlled heartbeat. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Jeffers rode out to the Vaughn property. Seth met him in the yard. The 2 men looked at each other. "Seth Barnett," Jeffers said. It was not a question. "Roy Jeffers," Seth said. Also not a question. Jeffers dismounted. He was not carrying anything except the natural authority of his purpose, and he moved carefully, the way men move who have done this kind of work for long enough to know that nothing is gained by aggression. "I have a warrant from Brackett County, Texas," Jeffers said. "In 1879, your name." "Filed by Harlan Cross," Seth said. "Filed by the county sheriff's office," Jeffers said. "Which was Harlan Cross," Seth said. "A man who is currently under investigation by the federal marshal's office." That was not entirely true yet, but it would be if Daniel Cray responded to the letter. Seth had calculated the risk and decided that the suggestion of it, presented with confidence, was worth deploying. Jeffers was quiet for a moment. "What investigation?" "The kind that happens when a former deputy marshal provides a federal officer with documented evidence of corruption and a protection scheme involving stolen cattle." Seth kept his voice even. "I'm not saying this to obstruct you, Jeffers. I'm saying it because I think you should know the warrant you're carrying was manufactured by the man I was trying to expose." Do with that what you choose." Jeffers looked at him for a long time. Seth could see him weighing it, the professional calculus of a for-hire man trying to determine whether the ground under the warrant was solid or already shifting. "I'll hold the warrant pending verification," Jeffers said at last. "If your federal case is as you describe, the warrant may be rendered invalid. If not," he let the rest of the sentence be present without saying it. "Understood," Seth said. Jeffers tipped his hat slightly and rode back toward town. Seth let out a breath that had been pressed against his ribs for 3 days. Myrtle appeared at his elbow. She had been standing in the doorway of the barn within hearing range. "You didn't have an active federal investigation yet," she said. "I have the framework for one," he said. She looked at him with something between alarm and admiration. "That was a gamble." "Yes, a very large gamble." "I'm not ordinarily a gambling man," he said. "I appear to be becoming one." She shook her head, but there was something in her eyes that was not disapproval. She stepped closer and put her hand against his jaw very briefly and looked at him with those clear and seeing eyes of hers. "Don't die on me," she said, simply and directly, which was the most intimate thing she had ever said to him. "I have no intention of it," he said. Marshal Daniel Cray's response came 12 days later, and it was more than Seth had hoped for. Cray had heard of Harlan Cross through other channels. There had been complaints from other quarters, other deputies with similar stories who had been dismissed or discredited. Cray was building a case and had been for some time. He asked Seth to provide a written deposition, a full and detailed account which Seth wrote over 2 evenings at the kitchen table with Myrtle reading each page as he finished it. "You have a good memory," she said. "Trained habit," he said. "You learn early in law work to remember details." "Law work," she said, looking at him. "Former law work," he said. "Maybe not permanently former," she said, with a look that was forward-facing and specific, and he understood that she was imagining a future for him that was different from the one he had been existing in, and the feeling that gave him was almost too large for the room they were sitting in. The deposition went to Cray. The second letter, from Seth's contact in Texas, arrived a week after that with sworn statements corroborating key elements of Seth's account. Cray moved quickly. Harlan Cross was suspended from his position in December of 1882, pending a federal inquiry that would eventually result in his trial in the spring of 1883. The Brackett County warrant against Seth Barnett was officially dismissed on December 14th. Seth read the dismissal letter standing at the kitchen table with Myrtle beside him, her shoulder against his arm, reading at the same pace he was. When they both finished, she said nothing for a moment. Then she took the letter from his hand, put it face down on the table, turned to him, and kissed him with considerably more purpose and length than the first time, which was already one of the better kisses of his life. Clara, who had appeared in the kitchen doorway at precisely the wrong or right moment depending on your perspective, said finally, with a satisfaction that was almost parental in its completeness, and retreated back to her room. The remaining problem was Cord DeLacy. The loan was paid. The cattle were sold. Seth's situation was resolved. But DeLacy was still there, still adjacent to the Vaughn land, still nursing his claim and his bitterness, and the harassment had not entirely stopped. A water trough had been contaminated in November, clearly deliberate. Fences cut again in December. Seth had been thinking about DeLacy's claim since the autumn. The boundary dispute, the old survey from 1873. He had spent several evenings at the county record's office in the nearest larger town, Mesilla, reading through land surveys and legal correspondence. What he found was interesting. The 1873 survey that had settled the boundary in the Vaughn family's favor had been conducted by a surveyor named Amos Briggs. Briggs had used established survey markers and standard methodology. His work was sound. The Vaughn boundary was correctly placed, but what the records also showed, and what had apparently been overlooked in 1873, was that a strip of land on the eastern edge of DeLacy's own property had been incorrectly described in the original DeLacy family deed. in a way that had actually given the DeLaceys more land than they were entitled to. Not less. More. It was not a large strip. Perhaps 40 acres. But it was the eastern 40 acres of the DeLacy property, and those 40 acres included the water source that fed DeLacy's largest pasture. Seth brought this information to Myrtle, who sat with it for a long time. This could be used as leverage, Seth said carefully, not to threaten him directly, but to make clear through a lawyer that any escalation of his campaign against the Vaughn property would be met with a formal challenge to the DeLacy deed's water rights. Myrtle looked at him steadily. That's not threatening him with something false. No, Seth said. It's a real legal finding. It would need to be properly filed, reviewed, potentially challenged, but it's real. She thought about it for 2 days. Then she hired a lawyer in Mesilla, a quiet and methodical man named Henry Acaffer, who reviewed Seth's research and confirmed its substance. In January of 1883, Acaffer sent a formal legal notice to Cord DeLacy's address, outlining the survey discrepancy and stating that the Vaughn family was prepared to file a formal challenge to the DeLacy deed if the harassment of Vaughn property continued. The incident stopped, completely and permanently. Seth heard from Tom Ferris, who heard from the barkeep at the Copper Bell, that Cord DeLacy had been furious for about a week and then had gone very quiet on the subject of the Vaughns, which was the quietness of a man who has been outplayed at his own game and knows it. He never bothered them again. Sheriff Purvis, reading the legal developments with the instinct of a man checking which way the wind was blowing, also quietly removed himself from DeLacy's orbit and began treating Myrtle's property complaints with the kind of professional attention they had always deserved. January of 1883 settled over the Vaughn land with a cold that was relatively gentle by Eastern standards, but felt like a new season in more ways than the meteorological one. The farm was stable. The loan was paid. The threat was neutralized. Elias Vaughn had another good spell and came out to help with the lighter ranch work for several consecutive weeks, and watching him work alongside Seth with something approaching equanimity was one of the things Myrtle mentioned quietly one night when she and Seth were sitting by the fire inside. "He likes you," she said. "He tolerates me," Seth said. "For my father, those are nearly the same thing," she said and smiled. Clara had turned 15 in December and was now convinced she had single-handedly brought about the entire romantic situation, which Seth and Myrtle both allowed her, because it cost nothing and meant everything to her. She was doing well with her studies, working through borrowed books with the same methodical intensity as her sister, and Myrtle had begun talking about the possibility of a proper school in Mesilla for Clara when things were more stable. "There are things she could become," Myrtle said, in that forward-facing way she had adopted more and more since November, "if she has the right preparation." "You could be the right preparation," Seth said. "You wanted to teach." "I'm not qualified." "You're teaching her now," he said. "Every day." She looked at him. "You have a way of reframing things," she said. "Is that a complaint?" "No," she said. "It's one of my favorite things about you." He proposed to her in February. He did it at the northeastern fence post because it seemed right, because it was where her name was carved into the cedar and where she had confronted him about it, and where they had said their first fully true things to each other. He had asked Elias for his blessing the week before. Elias had given it with gruff and genuine emotion, and then they had not spoken of it again, which was exactly the right way to handle things with Elias Vaughn. Myrtle had ridden out to the post to check the fence line, the same errand she had been on the day she discovered the carving. Seth was already there when she arrived. He had gotten there earlier on the pretense of checking the neighboring section, and he was standing beside the post with his hat in his hands and the whole landscape open and winter pale around him. She pulled Biscuit up and looked at him, recognizing something in his posture and his bare head in the February cold. "You're going to say something important," she said. "Yes," he said. "The fence line doesn't actually need checking," she said. "Not particularly," he said. She dismounted and stood facing him, and her eyes had that direct and seeing quality, and her cheeks were cold-reddened, and she was completely herself in every particular. And Seth thought he had never once in his life been so certain of anything. "Myrtle Vaughn," he said, and gestured slightly at the post behind her, where the name was. "I carved your name into this post before I had any reason to, before I knew anything about you except that you were real and you ran your land and you didn't suffer fools. And everything since then has been the proof that whatever that impulse was, it was the truest thing I've done in a long time." He paused. "I would like very much to give you reasons to carve my name somewhere too. I would like to stay here, not as a ranch hand, but as something permanent. I would like to marry you if you'll have me." She was quiet for a moment that lasted approximately one lifetime. "Seth Barnett," she said, very deliberately, and then she smiled, the full, real smile that transformed her face. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, and the winter wind came across the ridge and moved through the dry grass along the fence line, and above them the sky was enormous and clear and purely blue. They were married on the 14th of March, 1883. The ceremony was small, held in the farmyard because the church still had no pastor, and Myrtle asked the Mesilla judge, a dignified man named Foster, to ride out and officiate. Henry Acaffer, the lawyer, came as a guest. Tom Ferris came. Abel Bowman had been informed by letter and sent a warm congratulatory note and a very good ham, which was practical and perfect. Gus from the Copper Bell came and stood in the back in his good coat, looking touched against his will. Clara stood beside Myrtle as her witness, and cried through most of the ceremony in a way that suggested she was aware of her own role in proceedings, and was fully prepared to take credit for it at any appropriate future opportunity. Elias Vaughn stood beside his daughter and gave her hand to Seth with a steadiness that suggested he was drawing on reserves of sobriety and dignity that he did not always have access to. And Seth received that handshake as the gift it was. Myrtle wore her best dress, a deep blue calico with white at the collar and sleeves, and she had let her hair down for the occasion, dark and long, and she was absolutely magnificent in the way of a person who is completely comfortable in their own skin and surrounded by the people they love. Seth wore his good coat, the one he had ridden into Caldera Wells in, cleaned and brushed within an inch of its life by Clara while Seth was out working the morning of the wedding, and he stood and watched Myrtle walk toward him across the yard and felt something settle in him so completely that it was almost structural. Like a building finally having its last beam placed, like a thing made permanent. Judge Foster performed the ceremony with brisk warmth, and when he pronounced them married and Seth kissed his wife, Clara made a sound that was simultaneously a cheer and a sob, and Tom Ferris whistled, and even Gus clapped with the gruff enthusiasm of a man who is privately quite pleased about the world. The spring of 1883 brought good rains. The land responded. The cattle were healthy, and the grass came back across the depleted pastures with a lushness that felt almost aggressive, as though the land had been saving itself up. Myrtle and Seth worked side by side through the planting and the cattle management, and the rhythm they had established was deeper now, the easy competence of two people who know each other well and trust each other completely. Elias had more good months than bad that spring and summer. He was never entirely well, and both Myrtle and Seth understood that his drinking had done damage that was not reversible. But there were weeks when he was steady and present and helped with the lighter work and sat with them at the table in the evenings, and those weeks were gifts they were grateful for. Clara, with the energy and persistence that was apparently a Vaughn family trait, had been corresponding with a women's teacher training program in Santa Fe. In the summer of 1883, she received a letter of acceptance. She was 15 and a half, too young to begin immediately, but the acceptance was conditional on her beginning at 16 with a full academic preparation, which gave everyone a year to get ready. "She's going to be extraordinary," Seth said, watching Clara read and reread the letter at the kitchen table. "She already is," Myrtle said, and the love in her voice when she said it was so clean and complete that Seth felt it too by proximity. The summer also brought the news from Texas that Harlan Cross had been convicted on 4 counts of corruption and 1 count of conspiracy to obstruct justice. The federal inquiry, built significantly on Seth's deposition and the corroborating statements, had resulted in a complete dismantling of Cross's operation. The former sheriff was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment in a federal facility. Seth received the news in a letter from Marshal Daniel Cray, who included in the letter a personal note of thanks for Seth's testimony and a comment, delicately phrased, that if Seth were ever interested in law work in the territory of New Mexico, Cray's office would be interested in having the conversation. He showed the letter to Myrtle that evening. She read it carefully. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking I'd like to know what you think," he said. She considered. "Marshal work would mean being away sometimes," she said. "Not always, but sometimes." "It would," he said. "If that's not what you want for this, I'll write back and decline." She shook her head slowly. She said, "No, I don't think you should decline. I think you were good at that work before it was taken from you, and I think you've been someone who needed a purpose larger than fencing and cattle from the beginning." She looked at him directly. "I also think Caldera Wells could genuinely use an honest lawman." He thought about Dale Purvis, who had been better since the DeLacy situation but was not fundamentally a different man. "Local would be better than a traveling marshal position," he said. "If Craig could arrange a territorial appointment here, then write back and ask for that," she said. "You're not a man without options anymore, Seth. Stop negotiating from the assumption that you have to take whatever's offered." He looked at her and thought, there she is. That is precisely who she is, and he was so profoundly glad she was his. In the autumn of 1883, Seth Barnett was appointed as the town marshal of Caldera Wells, a position that had technically not existed before, but that the territorial administration created at Daniel Cray's recommendation, partly because the region had long needed stable lawful authority, and partly because the events of the previous year had demonstrated clearly that the existing sheriff arrangement was inadequate. Dale Purvis retired to his farm rather than face the particular humiliation of being supervised, which suited everyone, and Seth took up the badge with the kind of quiet seriousness that makes people feel safe. The badge was different from the one Cross had tarnished. It was local, it was chosen, and it was his entirely. He wore it in the mornings when he rode into town, and he took it off in the evenings when he came home to the Vaughn property, which was no longer only the Vaughn property but the Barnett Vaughn property, as Seth had insisted, and Myrtle had agreed to after a pointed discussion about names and identity, and the fact that she had built the place as much as her father had. The property line included the cedar fence posts at the corners, the white-painted ones, including the northeastern post with Myrtle Vaughn carved into it, which had become something of a landmark and a household joke and an origin story all in one. Seth had, in fact, eventually carved his own name into the post beneath hers. He had done it quietly one afternoon when he thought no one was watching. Myrtle had found it the next day and come home with a look on her face that was composed of about 17 different things, the most visible being a happiness so thorough it looked almost like pain. She had not said anything directly. She had come inside and kissed him, which was better. By the spring of 1884, Myrtle was expecting their first child. She had told Seth on a Tuesday morning, plain and direct as always, over coffee. He had set his cup down and looked at her and been so completely undone by the information that she had laughed at the expression on his face, a laugh that was warm and tender and entirely without cruelty. "You look like you've been hit with a plank," she said. "I feel something adjacent to that," he said. "A very good kind of plank." She was steady and healthy through the pregnancy, working through the summer with modifications rather than stopping, because she was constitutionally unable to stop working and Seth had long since stopped suggesting it. He had learned instead to redistribute the heavier tasks away from her without making a production of it, which she appreciated and never formally acknowledged, which was also the right way to handle things with Myrtle. Clara left for Santa Fe in August of 1884, 2 months before the baby was due. The parting was hard, the particular quality of hard that comes when you lose someone to their future rather than to anything sad. She cried in the yard for about 30 seconds and then fixed both Seth and Myrtle with the brightest eyes possible and said, "I'm coming back at Christmas, and I expect there to be a baby by then," and climbed onto the stage with the posture of someone walking into their destiny on purpose. Elias died in September of 1884, quietly in his sleep, in one of his better periods. He had been increasingly fragile through the summer, and the doctor in Mesilla had been honest about the trajectory. The morning Myrtle found him, Seth was there before she said a word, the way he had learned to be present before the crisis fully arrived. He held her while she cried, which she did once and fully and without apology, and then they sat together for a long time in the early morning light of the room where Elias had spent most of his last years. "He was better at the end than the middle," she said. "That matters to me." "It should," Seth said. "It's true." She was quiet. "He loved us," she said, "imperfectly but genuinely." "Yes," Seth said, "he did." They buried Elias Vaughn on the property he had loved and failed and loved again, with the mountains visible to the north and the fall light coming gold across the desert. Henry Acaffer came, and Gus, and Tom Ferris, and the neighbors who had known Elias in his better years. Seth stood beside Myrtle and she held his hand, and in her other arm she held the considerable weight of her 8 months pregnant stomach, and she was the most formidable and present person at the whole proceeding. Their son was born in October of 1884. He arrived on a cool Tuesday morning, attended by the town's midwife, a competent and unsentimental woman named Ruth Cabrera, who managed the whole proceeding with the calm of someone who has seen this miracle the appropriate number of times to treat it professionally, without losing its significance. Seth was in the house throughout, and he held Myrtle's hand until Ruth Cabrera tactfully displaced him and took over, and he stood outside the bedroom door and listened and waited with the specific helplessness of a man who is used to handling every situation and cannot handle this one. When Ruth Cabrera opened the door and said, "You have a son, Marshall," Seth went in and sat on the edge of the bed beside his wife and looked at the small, incomprehensibly real person in her arms, and he did not embarrass himself exactly, but it was close. "He looks like you," Myrtle said. She was exhausted and absolutely radiant. "He looks like a person who has opinions and is not yet equipped to express them," Seth said. She laughed softly because she was tired. "I want to name him Elias," she said, "after my father." "Elias Barnett," Seth said, trying it. Then, "Elias James Barnett," because his own middle name was James and it felt right to give the child a full name, a name with roots on both sides. "Yes," Myrtle said, "that's exactly right." Clara came at Christmas, as promised, and met her nephew with the unfiltered enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting for this specific meeting for months. Elias James Barnett, who was by then 2 months old and in possession of opinions he had still not fully figured out how to express, responded to his aunt's boundless energy by staring at her with wide, grave eyes and allowing himself to be held with the regal tolerance of someone accustomed to adoration. "He has Seth's eyes," Clara announced. "Everyone keeps saying he looks like someone," Myrtle said. "He looks like himself." "He looks like himself who looks like Seth," Clara maintained, with the absoluteness of a young woman who was studying education and had strong views about accuracy. Christmas of 1884 in the Barnett Vaughn farmhouse was a warm and disorganized and thoroughly alive thing. Ruth Cabrera came for dinner. Tom Ferris came. Gus from the Copper Bell, who had become an unlikely fixture in their social world, arrived with a bottle of good wine and a gift for the baby that was a small carved wooden horse, made by his own hands, which he presented with the gruffness of a man who is pretending he does not care whether the gift is appreciated while caring enormously. The wooden horse was placed on the mantelpiece and stayed there for years. Seth sat at the dinner table and looked around at the room, at Myrtle managing the serving with one hand and holding Elia's with the other, at Clara talking to Tom Ferris with the confidence of a young woman who had been living in Santa Fe for 5 months and had strong opinions about everything, at Gus pretending not to enjoy himself while entirely enjoying himself, at the fire and the food and the cedar beams of a room that had become, over the last 2 years, the specific and irreplaceable center of his world. He thought about a Tuesday morning in August of 1882, a man on a horse with nothing but a bad past and a bedroll, stopping at a fence post at the edge of someone else's land and feeling, for reasons he could not then name, compelled to pick up a knife and cut letters into the wood. He thought about how that small and inexplicable act had led, by the strange and non-negotiable logic of how things actually happen, to everything in this room. Myrtle caught him looking and raised an eyebrow at him across the table. He smiled. She shook her head at him, but she was smiling too. The full smile, the real one. The one she had been giving him more and more freely since the porch in October of the previous year, and had never once pulled back. Later that night, after the guests had gone and Clara was asleep and Elias was fed and sleeping in his cradle, Seth and Myrtle stood together at the kitchen window looking out at the dark land and the extraordinary December sky, full of stars in the way of desert skies that have no competition. "What are you thinking?" she asked. "I'm thinking I'd like to ride out to the post in the morning," he said. She looked at him. "The fence post." "I want to show it to Elias when he's old enough to understand it," Seth said. "I want to tell him about the Tuesday morning and his mother's name in the cedar and why it matters." Myrtle was quiet for a moment. "You want to tell him the origin story," she said. "Yes. He'll ask why you did it," she said. "Why you carved my name before you knew me." "I'll tell him the same thing I told you," Seth said. "I heard someone describe a woman who was real and who cared about what she'd built. And something in that made me need to mark the moment I arrived at a place worth arriving at." She leaned against his side and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the window together in the warm kitchen while the cold stars moved over the mesa. "And what will you tell him after that?" she asked. "After the marking and the beginning. What comes after the beginning in the story you'll tell him?" He thought about it, about the whole shape of the 2 years, the work and the fear and the letters written, and the drives made and the threat neutralized and the badge resumed, and the loss and the birth and the Christmas dinners and the evenings on the porch and the carved wood and the 2 names in the cedar, his and hers, permanent in the post at the northeastern corner of land that was theirs. "I'll tell him that the best things don't announce themselves," Seth said. "That a man can ride into a Tuesday morning with nothing but his history and his instincts, and stop at a fence post and do something without fully knowing why, and that sometimes the thing he does is exactly right. That the beginning is just the beginning, that what comes after is the whole rest of the story." Myrtle was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, "That is exactly what you should tell him." They went to bed in the house on the land with the names in the post and the child in the cradle, and the stars outside above the mesa, and the mesa outside above the desert and the desert holding everything else. And the morning would come with work and coffee, and the sounds of an ordinary life that was full to its edges with meaning. And in the spring, the grass would come again as it had the previous spring, and their son would grow toward the man he was going to be. And Clara would come home at Christmas again with more opinions and more brightness, and the cedar fence post at the northeastern corner of the property would stand through many more seasons with both their names in it, Seth's. Beneath Myrtle's, both cut deep and both darkening beautifully with age, proof of a beginning that had led, by every possible measure, to the best ending. The northeastern corner of the Myrtle Vaughn property became something of a destination in the years that followed. Not a formal landmark, nothing official, just a place that people knew about. Travelers on the Mesilla Road would sometimes stop and look at the post, having heard some version of the story. The drifter who carved a woman's name before he met her. The woman who found it and challenged him about it. the two of them building everything they had from that strange and impulsive beginning. Seth became a well-regarded marshal over the following years. He was consistent and honest, and had the particular quality of a man who has seen corruption from the inside and carries that knowledge as a permanent standard against which he measures everything. The people of Caldera Wells trusted him with the straightforward trust that comes from a long and unbroken record of doing exactly what you said you would do. Myrtle expanded the cattle operation gradually, adding sheep in 1886 and a small apple orchard on the northern edge of the property in 1887, because the rainfall patterns had shifted enough to make it possible, and because she had always had a vision for the land that was larger than what any single difficult season had allowed her to execute. The orchard became Seth's particular love. He was out in it in the early mornings before his rides into town, in the cool of the desert dawn, and Elias, as the boy grew old enough to walk and then run, followed his father through the young trees with the gravity of a small person, learning what it means to tend something living. Clara graduated from her teacher training program in Santa Fe in June of 1886. She came home for the summer and then took a teaching position in Mesilla, which was close enough for regular visits and far enough for the particular kind of flourishing that requires its own space. She was exceptional at the work, which surprised no one who had known her. She had a gift for making children feel understood, which was perhaps the most important gift a teacher could have. Their second child, a daughter they named Eleanor after Myrtle's mother, was born in March of 1887. Eleanor Barnett arrived with a forcefulness that Ruth Cabrera, who was still managing births in the territory at 62, described as the most determined entry I have witnessed in recent memory, which was the high bar of compliment from a woman who did not give them lightly. Eleanor had Myrtle's dark hair and Seth's gray eyes, which was a combination that looked more striking than either set of parents separately, which Seth pointed out, and Myrtle said was vanity on his part, and he maintained it was simply accurate. Elias James Barnett, 3 years old when his sister was born, accepted her presence with philosophical resignation for approximately 2 weeks, and then became her most devoted protector, which was a character development that lasted his entire life. On a spring morning in 1888, Seth rode out early to check the northern fence and took 5-year-old Elias with him, because the boy could now ride a small, patient horse named Button, and because this was the morning Seth had been thinking about for years. They reached the northeastern corner post in the early light, the sky going from gray to gold in the east, the desert smelling of rain from the previous night. Seth lifted his son down from Button and set him in front of the post, and the boy looked at it with his father's gray eyes. "What's that?" Elias asked, pointing at the letters. "That's your mother's name," Seth said. "It's in the wood," Elias said, with the particular observation of a child who is noting that this is unusual. "That's right," Seth said. "I put it there." Elias looked at him. "Why?" Seth crouched down beside his son so they were at eye level with each other and with the post. He looked at the letters, cut deep and darkened now with 6 years of weather, Myrtle Vaughn in the cedar, and below it his own, Seth Barnett, added a little later but permanent just the same. "Because," he said, and chose his words with the care of a man talking to someone very small about something very large, "I came here a long time ago before I knew your mother, and I stopped at this post and I felt something, a feeling that this was the right place. And I wanted to mark that feeling. I wanted to remember it." He paused. "Sometimes you arrive somewhere and you know before you even know why that it matters. That's what happened here." Elias thought about this with the seriousness of a 5-year-old considering a large idea. Then he pointed at the second set of letters. "That's your name." "That is," Seth said. "You put that one later." "A bit later," Seth said. Elias nodded, satisfied with this as a sequencing. Then he reached out and put his small fingers against the letters of his mother's name, tracing them. "Mama," he said, as if confirming something. "Yes," Seth said, "your mama." Elias looked at his father and then back at the post. I want to carve something too, he said. Seth considered this. When you're older, he said, when you have something you want to say. What should I say? Elias asked. Seth looked at his son, at the small, serious face in the early light, at the post behind him with the two names cut deep into the wood, at the land spreading out in every direction, the land that was theirs, built out of drought and debt and harassment, and a drifter's inexplicable impulse, and a woman's extraordinary refusal to fail and everything that had come after. He thought about what he would carve if he were carving for the first time right now, knowing everything he knew. You say whatever is the most true thing you know, Seth told his son. Whatever you know for certain, whatever you've built or arrived at or found, you put that in. Elias nodded slowly, thinking about it, and Seth could see the gears turning, the formation of a small person's future sense of what was worth preserving. They rode back to the farmhouse as the sun came fully up. Myrtle was in the kitchen with a leaner on her hip and coffee on the stove, and she looked at them as they came in with the particular expression of a woman who has everything she needs in the room with her. "How's the fence?" she asked. "Good," Seth said. "Sound and solid." She handed him a cup of coffee and held his eyes for a moment over the rim of it, and he held hers back, and between them in that simple exchange was everything the morning had been and everything the years before it had built, the whole story of how they had arrived here, from a carved name and a frightened finding, and a conversation by a fence post to this kitchen in this house on this land with these two children and this coffee and this light. "Good," she said. "Come and eat." And he did, and they did, all four of them at the table in the spring morning, with the orchard coming into its first full bloom outside the window and the horses in the yard, and the sky opening enormous and clean above the mesa, and the cedar fence post standing at the northeastern corner of the property with both their names in it, deep and permanent and entirely true. There were more years after that, and they were full and various and not without difficulty, because no life of any substance avoids difficulty. There were dry years and wet years, a hard winter in 1890 that tested the cattle and the orchard both, a period of adjustment when Clara married a kind Mesilla schoolteacher named David Reyes and moved her life a little further from the farm, which was right and good and only a little sad. There were seasons when Seth's martial work brought the particular weight that comes with being the person a community depends on for justice, and seasons when the land demanded more than they felt they had to give it, and ordinary human seasons of small friction and restored tenderness and the ongoing work of knowing each other. But the core of it held. It held because it had been built on honest ground, on two people who had each seen enough of the world to know what was real and had chosen each other with clear eyes. Elias, when he was 12 years old, rode out to the northeastern post one September morning and came back an hour later with a jackknife in his pocket and a private expression on his face. Neither Seth nor Myrtle asked him about it directly, because they both understood, instinctively and separately, that some things need to be allowed their own territory. When Seth rode out to that corner on his morning patrol the following week, he found a third set of letters cut into the cedar post below his own. The letters were a little uneven, the work of a 12-year-old learning to carve, but they were cut with effort and care and pressed deep enough to last. Elias James Barnett. Seth sat on Mercury for a long time looking at it. 3 names in the post, 3 people who had decided, each in their own way and for their own reasons, that this place was worth marking as the one they belonged to. He rode home and told Myrtle, and she stood at the kitchen window and looked at the direction of the post even though it was too far to see, and then she looked at Seth, and the smile she gave him then was not the wry half-smile and not the full surprise smile but a different kind entirely, deep and quiet and suffused with a feeling that had no name other than the full and present satisfaction of a life built right. "Well," she said. "Well," he said. She turned back to the window and looked at her land in the autumn light, and Seth stood beside her and looked at it too, the low scrub and the distant mesa, and the sky that went on forever above the territory of New Mexico in the year 1892. and the fence post at the northeastern corner with 3 names in it, and the 4th name that would eventually be added when Alina Barnett, who was 5 years old and had her mother's absolute determination and her father's patient gray eyes, was old enough to ride out there and add her own, which she did, in time when she had something she wanted to say.